The autumn harvest celebration brought nearly everyone in Cedar Valley together in the clearing near the community church, where tables groaned under the weight of contributed food and children ran between adults with the wild energy of youth freed temporarily from chores and discipline. The celebration was a tradition that marked the end of growing season and the beginning of preparation for Utah's harsh winter, a time when the community came together to share abundance and strengthen bonds that would be tested by months of cold and isolation. Elizabeth Morgan arrived carrying 2 large baskets filled with fresh bread, rolls, and sweet pastries that had taken her 3 days to prepare. At 34, Elizabeth had the kind of quiet beauty that deepened rather than faded with time, her face showing both the sorrow of loss and the strength that came from surviving it. Her dress was simple but well maintained, her hair pulled back in a practical style, and her expression held the gentle openness of someone who genuinely cared about others' well-being. She had been widowed for 3 years when her husband Thomas died in a farming accident, leaving her with no children but with her elderly father Joseph to care for. Elizabeth had transformed her grief into purpose, opening a small bakery in her home that had become essential to the community. She set up her contributions on the dessert table, taking care to arrange everything attractively, then stepped back to survey the gathering. These celebrations always stirred mixed emotions in Elizabeth. She loved seeing the community together, but also felt acutely aware of her position as a widow without the protection of a husband's status. The Utah Territory in 1881 was a place where social structures were both more fluid than in established eastern cities and more rigidly enforced in certain ways, particularly around respectability and proper behavior. Patricia Whitmore arrived with her usual entourage, 3 younger women who had learned to echo Patricia's opinions and laugh at her jokes as the price of social acceptance. Patricia was the wife of Bishop Whitmore, a position that gave her considerable influence in Cedar Valley's social hierarchy. She was a handsome woman in her late 40s who wielded her status with the precision of someone who understood power and enjoyed exercising it. Patricia had been taking advantage of Elizabeth's kind nature for over a year, ordering custom-baked goods and then finding reasons to pay less than agreed, asking for donations for various church functions that Elizabeth could not refuse without seeming uncharitable, and generally treating Elizabeth as someone whose kindness could be exploited without consequence. Ben Carter stood near the edge of the gathering, uncomfortable as always in large social situations but present because his employer, John Morrison, expected all ranch hands to attend community events. At 26, Ben was still building his reputation and his future, working hard and saving money with the dream of eventually buying land of his own. He was tall and lean from years of physical labor, with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands that marked him as someone who earned his living through honest work. Ben had grown up in Nevada, drifted through several territories doing ranch work, and had settled in Cedar Valley 2 years earlier when he found employment with Morrison, who was known as a fair boss who paid well and treated his workers with respect. Ben noticed Elizabeth immediately when she arrived, as he always did. He had admired her from a distance since his first week in Cedar Valley, when he had witnessed her giving bread to a family whose father had been injured and could not work. Something about Elizabeth's combination of gentleness and quiet strength drew him, but Ben had convinced himself that a widow who owned her own business and was respected in the community would never be interested in a ranch hand with nothing but wages and dreams. So he had kept his admiration private, content to occasionally purchase bread from her bakery and exchange brief, polite conversations that never ventured into anything personal. Patricia's voice carried clearly across the gathering as she examined the dessert table with her companions. Her tone was deliberately loud enough to be overheard, cultivated to seem like casual conversation while actually performing for an audience. She picked up one of Elizabeth's rolls, examined it critically, and made a comment about how some people thought baking could compensate for lack of family or proper standing in the community. Her companions laughed on cue, and Patricia continued, saying that it was almost pathetic how Elizabeth tried to buy respect through charity, as if anyone could forget her circumstances through the gift of bread. The gathering fell into an uncomfortable silence, people hearing Patricia's words but looking away, unwilling to challenge the bishop's wife even when her cruelty was obvious. Elizabeth's face flushed red, and she looked down at the ground, her hands trembling slightly as she absorbed the public humiliation. Ben felt his jaw clench as he watched the scene unfold. Something hot and fierce rose in his chest, a combination of anger at Patricia's cruelty and frustration at the crowd's complicit silence. He had spent most of his life keeping his head down and staying out of conflicts that were not his concern, learned behavior from years of being dependent on employers' goodwill for survival. But watching Elizabeth's humiliation, seeing her shoulders hunch with shame while Patricia smirked at her own clever cruelty, Ben found he could not maintain that careful distance. Ben walked forward through the silent crowd, his boots making deliberate sounds on the packed earth as he approached the dessert table. Every eye turned to watch him, curious about what the quiet ranch hand might do. Ben stopped directly in front of Patricia Whitmore, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but carried an edge that made even Patricia pause. He told her plainly that Elizabeth Morgan's bread had fed half the valley at one time or another, that her generosity had kept families from going hungry during hard times, and that anyone who could not see the value in that revealed only their own poverty of character, not Elizabeth's lack of standing. The gathering went from uncomfortable silence to shocked silence. No one spoke to Patricia Whitmore like that, especially not a ranch hand with no family connections or social standing to protect him. Patricia's face turned an interesting shade of purple as she processed the audacity of this challenge. Her voice shook with indignation when she informed Ben that he clearly did not understand how things worked in Cedar Valley, and that his employment situation might become complicated if he continued making enemies of important people. Ben met her implicit threat with calm directness. He said that he understood perfectly well how things worked, that people with power often mistook cruelty for cleverness and silence for consent, but that understanding how something worked did not mean accepting it as right. He told Patricia that Elizabeth Morgan had more genuine respect in this community than Patricia could ever buy with her husband's position, and that everyone present knew it even if they were afraid to say so. Then Ben did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He turned to Elizabeth, who was staring at him with a mixture of shock, gratitude, and concern. He asked if she would allow him the honor of sitting with her during the meal, saying he would prefer the company of someone who knew the value of kindness over those who only knew the exercise of power. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. Ben offered his arm formally, as if escorting a lady at a fancy ball rather than at a harvest celebration in rural Utah. Elizabeth took it, and together they walked to one of the long tables, leaving Patricia standing by the desserts looking furious and, for the first time anyone could remember, uncertain. The crowd slowly resumed their activities, but something had fundamentally shifted. People began approaching Elizabeth and Ben at their table, thanking Ben quietly for saying what many had been thinking, sharing their own stories of Elizabeth's kindness, and making a point to sit near them in a clear statement of solidarity. Patricia's usual circle shrank as her companions sensed the changing social dynamics, and quietly moved toward the emerging majority. The day after the harvest celebration, Ben found himself unusually nervous as he rode into Cedar Valley on his day off, heading toward Elizabeth's bakery with no clear plan beyond apologizing if his defense had somehow made her situation worse. The small building attached to her home was warm and fragrant when he entered, the smell of fresh bread creating an atmosphere of comfort and welcome. Elizabeth looked up from behind her counter, and her face transformed with a genuine smile when she recognized him. She thanked him before he could speak, her voice thick with emotion as she explained that no one had stood up for her like that since her husband died, that she had been beginning to believe she deserved Patricia's treatment because everyone else seemed to accept it as normal. Ben felt his nervousness ease somewhat as he told her that Patricia's behavior was not normal or acceptable, just normalized by everyone's fear of challenging it. Their conversation that day lasted 3 hours, well past the point of any pretense about purchasing bread. Elizabeth closed the bakery and invited Ben to the small sitting area in her home, where her father Joseph dozed in a chair by the window. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing naturally from topic to topic. Elizabeth shared how she had started baking professionally, how the work gave her purpose after Thomas's death, and how her father's declining health worried her though she tried to stay positive. Ben talked about his dreams of owning land, about growing up moving from place to place, about his hope to finally build something permanent in Cedar Valley. What struck Ben most was how easy Elizabeth was to talk to, how her attention felt genuine and her interest real rather than polite. She asked questions about his work that showed actual curiosity about ranch life, and she laughed at his stories with unguarded delight. The age difference that Ben had convinced himself was insurmountable, 8 years with Elizabeth older, seemed irrelevant in the warmth of actual connection. For Elizabeth, Ben's company was a revelation. She had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen by someone, to have a conversation that was not about business transactions or community obligations but about actual human connection. Ben listened when she spoke rather than waiting for his turn to talk, and his questions suggested he was genuinely interested in understanding her rather than just being polite. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Ben would visit the bakery on his days off, initially with the excuse of purchasing bread but eventually dropping the pretense entirely. He began helping with tasks around Elizabeth's property that had been neglected, repairing her fence, fixing a leak in her roof, chopping wood for winter. The developing friendship between Elizabeth and Ben did not go unnoticed in Cedar Valley, where privacy was a luxury geography and social structure rarely permitted. Patricia Whitmore, still stinging from her public embarrassment at the harvest celebration, saw the relationship as an opportunity to regain her damaged standing by redirecting community judgment toward what she characterized as inappropriate behavior. She began a whisper campaign questioning the propriety of a respectable widow spending so much time alone with a young ranch hand, suggesting that Elizabeth was setting a bad example and that Ben was taking advantage of a lonely woman. The campaign might have gained more traction in an earlier time, but Patricia had miscalculated how thoroughly Ben's defense of Elizabeth had shifted community sentiment. Most people in Cedar Valley had their own stories of Elizabeth's kindness and had been quietly resentful of Patricia's treatment of her for months. Now, with someone having finally called out that behavior, they were less willing to participate in Patricia's attempts at reputation destruction. However, Patricia did find some support, particularly among those who had their own reasons to maintain rigid social hierarchies. They pointed out the age difference, questioned Ben's motives, and suggested that Elizabeth should be more careful about her reputation. The criticism reached Elizabeth through various channels, women who claimed to be concerned for her well-being but whose questions felt more like warnings. Elizabeth found herself torn between genuine happiness at Ben's friendship and growing anxiety about how their relationship appeared to others. One evening, as Ben worked on repairing Elizabeth's garden gate, she brought him coffee and then sat beside him on the porch steps. Her expression was troubled as she told him about the talks circulating through Cedar Valley, about people questioning the appropriateness of their friendship. She said she valued his company more than she could express, but she was worried about damage to both their reputations if they continued to be seen together so often. Ben set down his coffee and turned to face Elizabeth directly. He told her that he understood her concerns but disagreed with her conclusion. He said that giving in to gossip and unfair judgment was exactly what people like Patricia Whitmore counted on, that maintaining their friendship in the face of criticism was not defiant but simply honest. He admitted something he had not planned to say, that his feelings for her had grown beyond friendship into something deeper, and that he could not regret spending time with someone he cared about just because others found it inconvenient for their social calculations. Elizabeth's breath caught at Ben's admission, her heart pounding as she processed what he was saying. Elizabeth struggled for the next week with Ben's admission and her own complicated feelings. The truth was that she had developed deep feelings for Ben as well, had found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that felt both wonderful and frightening. But the age difference troubled her, not because 8 years seemed like an insurmountable gap but because she worried that Ben's feelings might be temporary, born from the drama of defending her rather than from genuine long-term compatibility. She was also conscious that she came with responsibilities, her elderly father who required increasing care, her business that demanded constant work, her past that included a marriage she still honored in her heart. She worried that Ben, at 26 and still building his future, might eventually resent the complications she brought with her. These anxieties came to a head when John Morrison, Ben's employer, requested a meeting with Elizabeth at her bakery. Morrison was a respected man in his 50s who ran his ranch with a combination of fairness and practical business sense that had earned him success and reputation. He told Elizabeth directly that he had noticed Ben's attachment to her and wanted to speak plainly about the situation. Elizabeth braced herself for judgment or warning, but Morrison surprised her. He said that Ben was the best worker he had employed in 20 years, reliable and skilled but also thoughtful in ways that suggested he would succeed at whatever he chose to pursue. Morrison said he had watched Ben carefully since the harvest celebration and had seen a change in the young man, a settling and focusing that suggested he had found something worth building toward rather than just working for. Morrison told Elizabeth that he was offering Ben a partnership in expanding the ranch into cattle breeding, a position that would come with profit sharing and eventually land ownership. He wanted Elizabeth to know this because Ben's decision would likely be influenced by whether he had a future in Cedar Valley beyond ranch hand wages, and that future would depend partly on whether Elizabeth saw any possibility of a life with him. The conversation forced Elizabeth to confront her feelings directly. She thanked Morrison for his candor and spent the next 2 days in careful thought, weighing her fears against her hopes. On the evening of the second day, she asked Ben to join her for dinner, saying she wanted to talk seriously about their situation. They sat in Elizabeth's small dining room after her father had retired for the evening, and Elizabeth spoke with the same honesty Ben had shown her. She admitted her feelings had grown deeper than friendship, that she cared for him in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. Elizabeth continued, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. She told Ben about her fears, that the age difference might matter more in future years than it seemed to now, that her responsibilities to her father and business might feel like burdens he had not signed up for, that people's judgment might wear on him over time. But she also told him about her hopes, that perhaps they could build something genuine together, that his presence in her life had awakened possibilities she thought had died with Thomas. She said she needed to know that Ben understood what he would be choosing if they pursued a real relationship, and that she needed to believe his feelings were based on who she actually was rather than on the drama of their initial connection. Ben listened carefully, letting Elizabeth finish completely before responding. Then he reached across the table and took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle as they wrapped around hers. He told her that he had been thinking about exactly these questions since his impulsive admission the week before. He said the age difference meant nothing to him except that she had more life experience and wisdom than he did, which seemed like an advantage rather than a problem. He said he knew about her father's needs and her business demands, had been observing them for months, and that building a life together meant exactly that, building something that accommodated both their realities rather than expecting one person to abandon their responsibilities for the other's convenience. As for people's judgment, Ben said that Patricia Whitmore had already taught him that living according to others' expectations was a guaranteed path to unhappiness, and that he would rather face criticism with Elizabeth than acceptance without her. He admitted that he could not promise perfection or that challenges would not arise, but he could promise honesty, effort, and genuine care for her well-being. He asked if that was enough for her to take a chance on building something together. Elizabeth felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion closing her throat. Ben stood and pulled her gently to her feet, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like both shelter and homecoming. They stood there for a long moment, Elizabeth's face pressed against Ben's shoulder, both of them feeling the weight of fear releasing and possibility opening. The following months were not without challenges, as they had both anticipated. Patricia Whitmore continued her whisper campaign, though with increasingly less effect as people grew tired of her negativity. Some community members maintained their disapproval, though they expressed it through distance rather than direct confrontation. But far more people supported the relationship, recognizing in Elizabeth and Ben a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and affection. John Morrison made good on his offer, bringing Ben into partnership on the ranch expansion. The additional income and status helped quiet some criticism, though Ben and Elizabeth both recognized that financial security was not why they had chosen each other. Elizabeth's bakery continued to thrive, and Ben's help with the physical demands of the business allowed Elizabeth to expand her offerings and her income. They were married in a simple ceremony 6 months after the harvest celebration, with most of Cedar Valley in attendance despite Patricia's attempts to organize a boycott. Bishop Whitmore, who had been quietly appalled by his wife's behavior but uncertain how to address it, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Elizabeth's father Joseph, increasingly frail but still sharp-minded, gave his blessing with tears of relief that his daughter would not face the future alone. The marriage proved to be everything both had hoped, a partnership of equals who challenged and supported each other, who made space for each other's needs and dreams, who faced difficulties together rather than alone. Ben proved to be not just a devoted husband but also a patient and caring son to Joseph, spending evenings reading to the older man and listening to stories of earlier times with genuine interest. Elizabeth supported Ben's ranching ambitions while continuing to build her own business, both of them recognizing that their individual successes strengthened rather than threatened their relationship. 2 years after their marriage, as they sat together on their porch watching the Utah sunset paint the red rocks in shades of amber and gold, Elizabeth reflected aloud on how dramatically her life had changed since that harvest celebration. She said that Ben's refusal to stay silent when she was insulted had given her back something she had lost without realizing, her sense that she deserved to be treated with dignity, and that she had the right to expect better than cruelty disguised as social propriety. Ben pulled her closer and reminded her that she had always deserved that dignity, that his speaking up had simply named what everyone already knew but had been afraid to acknowledge. He said that the real transformation had not been in him finding courage, but in the community finding permission to act on what they had always believed was right. As the stars began to appear in the vast Utah sky, Elizabeth and Ben sat in comfortable silence, their intertwined hands and peaceful expressions telling a story of two people who had found in each other not rescue but partnership, not escape but belonging, and not completion but the kind of companionship that made both of them more fully themselves. Ben's refusal to stay silent had indeed changed Cedar Valley, but perhaps more importantly, it had opened the door to a life neither of them had dared to imagine but both had desperately needed. 5 years after Ben Carter's defense of Elizabeth at the harvest celebration, Cedar Valley had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The changes were not dramatic upheavals but rather quiet shifts in how people treated each other, small acts of courage that accumulated into a different kind of community. And at the center of many of these changes were Ben and Elizabeth Carter, whose marriage had become a model of partnership, and whose willingness to stand up for what was right had inspired others to find their own voices. Elizabeth's bakery had expanded significantly, now occupying a dedicated building on Main Street with 2 employees who worked alongside her. But the business success was less important than what else the bakery had become. Elizabeth had established a quiet system where struggling families could exchange work for bread, where children could earn pastries by running errands, and where the elderly could gather in the small seating area she had created and feel part of the community rather than isolated by age or circumstance. The bakery had become a kind of community center, a place where people knew they would be treated with dignity regardless of their economic situation. Ben's partnership with John Morrison had flourished beyond either man's initial expectations. The cattle breeding operation had proven profitable, and Ben's careful management and innovative approaches had earned him respect throughout the territory. At 31, Ben owned a quarter share of the Morrison Ranch and had purchased additional land where he and Elizabeth planned to eventually build a larger home. But like Elizabeth, Ben's success was measured in more than financial terms. He had become known as someone who would stand up for his workers, who paid fair wages, and who could be counted on to help neighbors during difficult times. The young ranch hand who had once questioned whether he belonged in Cedar Valley had become one of its most respected citizens. Elizabeth's father Joseph had passed away peacefully 2 years after their marriage, surrounded by family and expressing gratitude for the years of care Elizabeth and Ben had provided. His death had been sad but not tragic, the natural end of a long life lived well. Joseph's final words to Ben had been simple but profound, thanking him for giving his daughter back her happiness, and for proving that a good man's character mattered more than his age or circumstances. Ben had been with Joseph at the end, holding the old man's hand, and the experience had deepened his appreciation for the family he had gained through marriage. The Carters' home had become a gathering place for others who felt marginalized or judged by Cedar Valley's more rigid social elements. Young couples facing disapproval over age differences or economic disparities found welcome at their table. Women struggling with widowhood or single parenthood discovered Elizabeth's practical support and emotional encouragement. Ranch hands and workers who felt dismissed by their social betters learned from Ben that dignity was not granted by others but claimed through how you lived your life.